So the next session is on innovative financing to support smallholders and marginal farmers to deal with the climate change. I request the moderator, Sudhir Sahani, along with the panelist, Mr. Adarsh Sharma, Ms. Dhruvi Shah, Mr. Shasha Lefel, and Mr. Ved Arya to be in the panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much to Cognisphere for giving us this opportunity for engaging in this conversation. A warm welcome to all our panelists physically here and online. I must confess that I am a bit of an infant in the development sector. I've spent more of my life in the corporate world, in advertising and communication. But even while I was there, I think one of the big things that a lot of advertisers and a lot of marketers used to say is that we have a sense that 50% of the money that we are spending on advertising is going waste. Unfortunately, we don't know which is that 50%. And so they had to spend everything. But I think one thing that kind of emerged very strongly, that even as people invest money and funds, they expect something in return. I think it is for all of us to decide, how do we measure that return? What is the return that we are all seeking? And I think a lot of people who mentioned funding and financing, even in the earlier panel, mentioned that it is important that it should be what we typically say win-win for both sides. If it's fair and just for people who are engaged as part of that investment decision and process, then I think it makes sense. My feeling also over the years is that you could be doing well for yourself and still you could be doing good for everybody else. I don't think the two are conflicting objectives for us to pursue. And if we do that at an individual level, if we do that at an organization level, if we do it at a community level, if we do it at a country level, and perhaps if we do it on a global level, then we can save the earth that Naren was so strongly pleading for. We can respond to the needs of the planet that we are all inhabitants of. So having said that, I think what I will now do is, since we are, I think, running a little behind time, we will try and have a kind of input from about 7 to 8 minutes from each one of our panelists. And then we will see if we have some more time for some response questions or reflections, then we will try and take that up, if that's okay. Yeah. So I'll start with you, Dhruvi. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yeah, okay. Dhruvi, given that Axis Bank Foundation's focus on creating sustainable livelihoods is very strongly established, I was very keen to understand how much is climate change and climate action actually integrated into the concept of sustainable livelihoods. And also, are there any specific result areas related to climate action or climate resilience that you encourage your grantees to build into the programs and the proposals that they develop?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And it was really interesting to listen to the first panel and kind of remembered some of the work that I'd done many years ago. So to answer, Sudhir, your question is, I often get asked is, do you work on climate change? And I never used to really have an answer. But when we look at sustainability and we look at longevity of the work that we are doing, it is addressing the problems that people are facing today. And that problem cannot be looked at in isolation if you do not look at the impact that they are having because of the changing climate. The community has always responded to the problems they face, and climate has been an integral part of the challenges or the change that they have witnessed over the years. It's just that the world is now talking about it. The changes are happening much faster. There is a conversation around climate change happening on the more very, very often. So yes, the sustainability embedded in our livelihood approach does address the issues that the community face because of climate change in various degrees. How are we helping them address that? Through everyday livelihood strategy. So the conversation on revival of traditional seeds, soil cover, access to irrigation, more crop drop, having these discussions at the community level, building community institution is an attempt to address the everyday challenges they are facing. What are the limitations that we have today? And when I mean both us and our partners and the community, is our inability to articulate, measure both at the what is the impact of climate on the particular livelihood that they are having, and largely it's agriculture and also livestock now, what we saw this year. So it's that lack of data, lack of information to isolate a problem to climate change and therefore address it. A lot of it is not about mitigation, but adaptation. Sometimes we get very confused between what is adaptation, mitigation, and all of that. But it's honestly trying to create adaptative strategies, and now in a more aggressive manner. And what we really found when we started saying, okay, let's start seeing how much we can measure in the context of climate change, and we don't have data, we don't have information. At the global, at a district level, at a state level, maybe yes. But when you look at the problem is very micro. The problem is very, very between few villages. I mean, few villages, there is rainfall and the next 10 villages don't have rainfall, right? So it's that micro now. So do we have data information to help solve this problem? We don't. So that's the first problem and the first hurdle that implementers have to solve, not the community. They don't have the wherewithal, is to now look at grounds up conversations and grounds up data to see and isolate the climate change issues. Sometimes they all get muddled up. So that's a challenge that we are seeing and intending to work towards it. We have not started, I'll be very honest. But that is something we want to and should be doing as we go along from here.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Rui. Thanks for the candid sharing. I think all of us kind of appreciate that, putting together data and putting towards matrices which kind of make sense in the context of climate action and issues of mitigation is something that, and adaptation is something that we all need to do. But I think it's encouraging to note that a lot of your programs have built in some of the aspects of climate action. And as you rightly said, the communities have always been conscious of that. It's just that I think we are coming alive a little more to that. But I think it's important that we come alive to those issues. We also track them consciously so that it then becomes part of our way of working rather than just an exception to the rule. And
to that, I'll just add one or two things, maybe just in the opportunity. I think that is where a lot of civil society organizations need to geographically come together and create common resources to be able to get the information and data and also strategies, not work in isolation. And that's a huge challenge, to be very honest.
I want to now move to Sasha. Can you hear us? Sasha, are you there?
Yes. Good morning from Germany. Hello.
Morning. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. How are you, Sudhir?
We are good. I understand Bayern Munich is out of the Champions League. So
let's not talk about it.
No, so I just want to take up from where Dhruvi left, and our understanding is that you spent a couple of decades, if not more, on issues of climate crisis, green energy and water scarcity. But your starting point, I understand, was as an inspiration of improving livelihoods for the global South and making good business work, as you put it. So we would be keen to know from your experience if livelihoods need to be integrated with climate action strategies, and from a funder's point of view globally, what are the expectations for supporting climate action initiatives?
Yeah, thanks for the questions, Sudhir. So I've prepared a couple of slides. I hope you can see my screen.
Oh, yes.
Can you see it?
Okay, that's yours. Yeah. Okay, we can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So in order to structure this a little bit, I've prepared some slides. I've seen that my colleague Nirmal has already been speaking in the prior session, so I don't need to explain where I come from. I think just maybe very few words. So my company, Climate Partner, is really doing two things. On the one hand side, we are active in many, many countries developing and financing carbon reduction projects. On the other hand, we have about 6,000 corporate clients that want to get engaged in such projects. And Climate Partner in the middle is kind of bridging this gap between the rather Western companies on the one hand side who want to do climate action in other countries, and the carbon reduction projects in India, in Africa, in Latin America, and so on. So we are in between and bridging this. What is really, let me see how it works. When we talk about carbon finance and carbon credits that then can be used by these companies to go carbon neutral and making a claim of carbon neutrality, when we talk about this carbon finance world, we talk about what is usually being called the voluntary carbon market, the VCM. And when you look at the graph here on the right-hand side, you can see that this market is developing very dynamically over the last couple of years. It is still, to be honest, a very small niche market. So we are really talking about 1.2 billion USD market capitalization in 2022. So this is not a lot of money. If you look at the scale of the problem we are talking about, 1.2 billion is nothing. But you can see over the last couple of years, this market has grown rapidly, and it is predicted to grow tenfold by 2030. And I'm usually a conservative guy when it comes to growth predictions, but in this case, I would really concur with this prediction because we have so many growth drivers for carbon finance. We have the Paris Agreement with this rather abstract 1.5 degree target of global warming. 1.5 degrees should not be exceeded. And then we have a lot of regional and national legislation in all countries globally that address this and that try to implement this 1.5 degree target from the Paris Agreement. In the EU, for example, that's where I'm from, we have the EU taxonomy with regulations like the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation that really tells investors and asset managers to invest their money and report on that as well, according to ESG criteria. So this is all boosting our market and probably the most important boost for the voluntary carbon market and for carbon finance on the voluntary side is the SBTI initiative, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, that is really translating this 1.5 degree target, which is abstract, into corporate target settings. So a lot of corporates globally have set themselves so-called net zero targets that are in line with the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 degree target, and the SBTI initiative that was inaugurated by the WWF, so environmental NGO, by the World Resource Institute, and by leading asset managers and investors. With their guideline, the corporates are setting net zero targets, and carbon offsetting, carbon compensation, carbon credits, they play a crucial role on the way to net zero for many, many corporates. And that justifies and explains the growth in this market in the past, but also in the future. What we really see at the moment still is that there is a smallholder climate finance gap. So a lot of this money is going, for example, in forest protection, the so-called REDD projects in Latin America and Africa, is going in renewable energy projects all over the world. But a lot of money is not going into really creating better livelihoods in rural communities in India, in Africa, and elsewhere. So we have a finance gap there, and the voluntary carbon market can really help addressing that. And we see at the moment clear tendencies within the voluntary carbon market and a lot of interest in really getting engaged in those rather smallish projects, the smallholder projects that are usually rural, that they are widespread. Often they're more complex than building a wind park in Brazil is easier than creating a sustainable farming project in a rural community in India. So, but I'm talking about this as well. So it's complex addressing smallholders with climate finance or carbon finance, but it's certainly possible. There are a lot of examples that are well functioning out there already. When talking about carbon finance, so I'm not going into detail here, but I think it's important to show the complexity around this. When talking about carbon finance, each project needs to go through this life cycle of a carbon credit or of a carbon offset project. And it's not easy to go through that. So first of all, the project documentation needs to be developed. Usually the local communities can't do this. Usually they need a local partner to do that, or an international partner like us to help them doing this. And this documentation needs to be in line with the quality criteria of the standards in the voluntary carbon market. For example, the gold standard or the verified carbon standard managed by Verra. And this project documentation that tells exactly why is your project additional? Why is the carbon reduction that is being achieved permanent? Why is there no leakage from your project? And so on and so forth. This project documentation needs to be validated by an independent auditor, needs to be accepted by the standard administrator, Gold Standard Foundation or the Verra Foundation. And then the project is being registered with a selected standard, and only then it is being implemented. Then it's running for 1, 2, 3 years. And then in either every year or every 2 or every 3 years, an external verifier comes and looks ex post at what has happened over the last 1, 2, 3 years of your project implementation. Is the project still up and running? Has it reduced carbon? If yes, how much? And then a verification report needs to be issued. And then the standard administrator again needs to accept this verification report. And only then the carbon credits are being issued. It's a long process, takes 1 to 3, sometimes 1 to 5 years to go once through it. And when you have gone once through it, you need to repeat the steps 6 to 8 every year or every 2 years, depending on your project. So it's complex. It's not easy. Looking specifically at smallholder and farmers and rural communities, I mean, we already see a lot of projects out there, especially in India, that are working quite nicely. The most institutional project type is referring to enhancing existing cooking practices. So
what did you say?
Cooking. So it's about switching from a climate point of view, inefficient cooking practices, the tripod cooking, open fires, etc., to efficient cook stoves. It's about providing household biogas installations, but it's also about providing water filters or water purification gadgets to rural households that really change their water behavior, if you want to call it like that, from boiling the water and then drinking it to filtering the water. So you save a lot of wood, you save a lot of carbon. So we have a lot of carbon projects out there that work with efficient cook stoves, household biogas, or water purification. We also see more and more a tendency towards sustainable farming practices for rural communities. And I think that is what Cognisphere and a lot of people here in this meeting are dealing with. That can be agri-silviculture, that can be drip irrigation, but that can also be afforestation, that can also be forest protection. So that there's a lot of different opportunities that are, carbon options, if you want to call it like that, that could be certified under the existing carbon standards, maybe the VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, or the Gold Standard. And what these things and these practices, these sustainable farming practices really do at the end of the day, they generate an additional income on the one hand side through the carbon credits for the local communities, but they really change their lives. I mean, I think in the prior session that has been addressed quite a lot, all the social benefits, and Dhruvi is very experienced in that as well. There is such a really huge amount of social benefits coming from this around gender equality, creating new job opportunities, but also a lot of ecologic benefits coming from that. Satya addressed this earlier. So the benefits are numerous. They're beyond the carbon reduction. The carbon reduction and the carbon certificates, they are just the vehicle to generate money for that. But the benefits are much more than carbon reduction, obviously. Most importantly, has already been mentioned, benefit sharing needs to be negotiated very, very thoroughly at the beginning. Obviously, since such projects are happening in rural, local communities, the communities need to benefit from that. It is not the kind of the intermediary that is grabbing the financial benefits from that. So the benefit sharing is important, and obviously the active participation of the rural communities in such a carbon project is very important. From an investor's point of view, we see much more interest these days. A lot of investors, they are forced by legislation. I mentioned the EU taxonomy, for example, to invest their money according to ESG criteria. So they are forced to look at things like these. They are interested in creating impact beyond carbon. They're interested in creating impact that contributes to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are challenges around this. It's complex. I mentioned this in the beginning. It's much more complex creating a sustainable farming project with hundreds of thousands of farmers in India, rural farmers that each own 1 hectare of land. It's much more complex doing that and bundling all that together in one carbon project as compared to build a wind park in China. That's easy compared to that. And we also have looking at the long-term engagement. These projects, they're running for 7, for 10, for 20, sometimes even for 30 years, depending on the project type. There is a high reversal risk and a high risk of that things change during the crediting period, during the duration of the project. That really needs to be addressed from an investor's point of view very clearly. Land rights need to be very, very clear when we talk about 20 years afforestation project in India. The land rights need to be secured for at least 20 years, obviously, in order to make sure that the carbon credits can be generated year by year from such a project. Additionality needs to be addressed. And I mentioned already that the benefit sharing model needs to be long-term and needs to be very clear. So it's, as I said earlier, it's not easy doing that, but it's possible. Why is Climate Partner getting engaged, for example, with Cognisphere Solutions here in Pradhan, in the Tassar silkworm rearing project? This project is much more than a carbon reduction project. And this is why we, Climate Partner, on behalf of our investors, are getting engaged here. It's about, for example, gender equality, and even more about women leadership. It's about really enhancing livelihoods and creating alternative livelihoods for a lot of marginalized households in the area. It is about a lot of ecological benefits. Satya mentioned that before. It's about restoring degraded soils. It's about promoting biodiversity. It's about reducing soil erosion and water runoff that leads to improved hydrology. So all of this is important. It's not only the carbon. The carbon is just the carbon reduction credit is the mechanism, the financial mechanism behind it. But the social and ecological benefits, they are what our clients are really looking at. And what Climate Partner is really looking at as well. That's as important as the carbon reduction. And last words on this slide here. When you have a project where you think that might have a chance to be accepted as a carbon project and can generate carbon finance, be prepared for a very thorough due diligence process. On the one hand side, we and other investors, they do always very thorough know your counterparty process, the so-called KYC process. So we always have to have local partners. We as climate partner, we can't do it on our own. So we have to have people from Cognisphere, from Pradhan or others. We work with a lot of NGOs in India and elsewhere. But we always need to make sure that over the course of 20, 30 years, these partners will still be there and will still be robust. And I think, Dhruvi, coming from a financial institution, you know exactly what I'm talking about here. So know your counterparty is very important, but at the same time, also the project level due diligence is very, very important. And especially when we're talking about nature-based projects, it's about geospatial analysis. It's about modeling the above ground and below ground carbon and so on and so forth. There's high complexity to it. It takes time to do it thoroughly, but once it's set up, the project design is set up, and once the things are running smoothly, then it's a beautiful concept, and carbon finance can really make a big difference and can channel a lot of money from the Western world, for example, to rural communities in India. I think I'll keep it there.
Thanks for sharing that, Sasha. It's encouraging to know that despite the challenges and complexities that you mentioned about looking at some of the rural livelihood-based projects, you are encouraging investors to come into that area and address some of those issues. Otherwise, as Shankar said, that it might be just rich making life easier for the rich rather than kind of making it more sensible and sustainable for all concerned, and at least try and address issues for people who perhaps stand to suffer the most because of the climate change. So that is encouraging. One thing that definitely comes to mind is, where is this money coming from? Are people still tending to invest out of the surplus of profits they are making? Is it being used as part of cost of doing business? How are they looking at this entire thing, at least on a global platform?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that is my daily bread and butter. So I'm talking on a daily basis to large companies that get engaged in climate action and get engaged in such projects. Things have changed. First of all, they have changed in terms of time frames. Usually these companies, they were thinking short term about this. They were thinking like, okay, yes, this year I want to go carbon neutral. I need to go to the market and buy some VERs. They were not ready for a real investment and for a real long-term investment. That has changed thanks to the Paris Agreement and thanks to the Science-Based Targets Initiative, thanks to net zero targets that are long-term targets. They are usually set for 2040, 2050, these targets. So companies have really changed their time focus and their time-wise thinking on that quite a lot. That is point number one. We are talking about long-term engagement there. And point number two is, it's not kind of coming entirely out of the marketing expenditures anymore. It used sustainability in the Western world was for a long time kind of a marketing and communications thing. So it came, you're very familiar with that, Sudhir. It came from the budget came from marketing, and that's it. So this has changed a lot as well. It is much more embedded into such expenditures, if you want to call it like that. I would rather call them investments. Such investments are much more embedded at the core of the corporate thinking. It's going up to the CEO level. A lot of and it's really bottom down, not bottom up. It's the other way around. It's top down actually. So you have to have a clear CEO commitment, and it is part of many. If you look at kind of value and mission statements of many large corporates, it's already embedded there, and that has changed a lot as well.
Great. That's good to know. And I'm hoping that action is following more than just mission statements. So yeah, but it's good to know that there is a definite change and you are quite optimistic about it. So thanks for sharing that. I will move to you, Ved, now. I think we've spoken a lot about the funder side and investors and what they are seeking. I think I just needed to get a sense from your end that, you had considerable experience training and working with social entrepreneurs, and including in your latest Buddha Fellowship program, which you started in 2016. My understanding also is that you're a big believer of collaboratives like the one that you started, the Rapid Rural Community Response. So what has been your experience of funding an ecosystem support for some of the young emerging leaders? And you deal a lot with the youngsters from IITs and IIMs who perhaps wish to work in the climate action space. Do you see good funding support happening, ecosystem support happening? Are the stakeholders, as you mentioned, from Samaj, Sarkar, Bazaar, are they looking to kind of work together to address the issues of climate change?
I want to start by this saying that in coalition, where Naren and I and many others, we came together, what we are doing there and what is the importance of the coalition. And this is to the point that Shankar, you were making in the beginning about policy. One of the key things we are doing there is research, and research is very complex, as Sasha pointed out in case of climate change. But we are trying to bring data or evidence from the ground or what is happening there, and this is something that Ruby also referred to. One data I want to share with you is that how many of you know, in fact, let me ask you a question. During 2021, when COVID was still raging and we also saw Delta wave in April, how many people skipped meals? How many people went hungry when they went to sleep?
I don't think I ever thought about it also.
So even with our data, I think 13%. 1 out of every 7 persons, 1 out of 8 persons went hungry in the night. Well, if that is not shocking enough with this UNDP data, I want to say that, everybody says PDS is successful. Some 80 crore people are getting food or Anna or Annadata, whatever. But 90% of the people who had PDS, that means ration card, went hungry. 90%. Skipped a meal. That means it's not that every day they went hungry. I'm trying to say that the question or a proposal to this audience and cognosphere is that how many people among the smallholders, among the 80 crore people, most of them are smallholders in this country, are affected by environmental crisis? How many are affected by whatever you call it, GHG emissions, or the extreme events of temperature or rain or whatever, etc. Even in our data, we are saying 30% of our people who responded affected by the climate event. So what is the data on which you can ask the government, you have to act? Whether Narega, you talked about 60,000 crores. And I witnessed the success of the project that Pradhan has done in Chhattisgarh, which ABF is also funding. They are doing debris, they are doing ponds, they are doing fisheries and then making livelihoods. But are we collecting data? I'm asking Pradhan that. It's from the environment angle, from the environment crisis angle, yes, from livelihood angle.
Okay.
We're collecting data.
Right.
But are we collecting data in terms of intergenerational impact of the work that you are doing?
Right.
It's all positive. So when Satya, you are presenting TUSSER data, the TUSSER project, I think this is another project, this major project in which you got 800 crores from the government on Narega. Fantastic work this mega watershed project is. Can we work with Chhattisgarh government and say that from environment angle, this is great and intergenerational leadership will be shown by women and their federations, and not just Pradhan, but BRLF and several NGOs are also involved. So I think the issue of data, evidence, as the marginal farmers, holders are being affected, and bring it to policy, bring it to people, and just not UNDP data. So because data, and I can say here with sense of responsibility, If we are not collecting data, we are not making policy. Then resource distribution in the country will be always be skewed, and you know who will get more resources, who will get highways from Delhi to Chennai, and so on and so forth. I think this is one thing I want to say. As a coalition, we are taking this huge effort, and 40 NGOs have participated out of this. So this is one thing in terms of coalition we are trying to do. Second thing I want to talk about the social stock exchange. You didn't mention it, but because there's an opportunity also for not just Cognizant sphere, but we found that in this day and age when FCRA is an issue, PMKS is an issue, how much money is, Shankar, you know how much money is going to come from CSR to the NGOs, and NGOs particularly. Probably we can see the social stock exchange as an opportunity where organizations like RCRC members, Cognizant itself, we can get registered. Even though we know there is a challenge that this zero coupon, zero principal bond itself is not still got from Nirmala Sitharaman any kind of tax exemption. But still, I think issue of legitimacy that NGOs do not have, but if you get registered under either BSE or NSE, whether Bombay Stock Exchange or a national stock exchange, at least in the eyes of the public, because SEBI is regulating, the government official body is regulating it, you will get certain sense of legitimacy, and therefore you can go to public, and for, of course, I can go into the technical details of what is required, etc. But 15 activities are permitted, and climate is also involved and included in that. So anybody who's doing environment work, and there are, of course, disclosures you have to make and so on and so forth. But there is a possibility, even if we think we are somewhat cynical of the present government, what it would do, I think still is a positive impact if we can make on financing this kind of work that we are talking about. Third, and I want to talk about the value chains that many of the Buddha fellows are doing this work in, say, mustard processing. In Karoli in Rajasthan, they are processing naturally grown mustard, that means no chemical, and then they are processing it as a most pungent oil you will see soon in Delhi market, more than Fortune and more than other this thing. Point of the entrepreneurship is that can we also bring private capital to this sector? When you're doing value chains, you getting more money to mustard farmers, more money to, say, tamarind collectors in Chhattisgarh, where also we are collaborating. Then only when there is an entrepreneur can there be a private investor.
Sure.
So the idea of doing this value chain through entrepreneurs is to finally not just bring Narega, but also bring private investors to invest, which finally will have social impact. And there, in terms of the climate, you are also aware that Selco is very much in the front and center of this, and our mustard processing, our millet processing, and as Sasha was saying, there's a lot of money. They are upfront investing in all processing machinery, which currently is sort of powered by the grid. Rather than that, they are putting out these plants. And they made millets, for example, is there one of the key. So a point I'm trying to make is that money can be brought from social stock exchange. Okay. Money can be brought from private investors if you have value chains that can become ecologically sound and environmentally beneficial, and as well as they are giving social impact. Third is that coalitions can bring evidence, a pre and before, after, as to what is the effect or impact the environment is having on the small holders, and coalition can play a role, and we can get more people also on board. Last point about geopolitics, it's not entirely that it is just agreements on paper. I happened to attend a meeting of Clinton Global Initiative last September in New York. And it was, of course, Clintons are there. So Barbados Prime Minister openly challenged the US government. It is because of you for last what you've done in 200 years, we are suffering. So somebody talked about oceans, how they are suffering. Only in the country or the parts of West Indies, we all know cricket, Barbados, we all know. Right. But all how the sea is rising, I think the prime ministers and the heads of state are taking this as issue in the geopolitics also. I thought that is important to also note. It's not entirely that not much is happening, that damages and laws are not being noticed. I think the countries that are affected are actually raising their voice in the international arena. Thank you.
Well, that's very encouraging to know that there can be various sources of funds. But I think what you raise issue about prime ministers and heads of states taking stock is also good to know. I, for one, get kicked in my shins every other day by my daughter to say, what are you guys up to and what have you done leaving behind for this generation? And I'm at a loss because I'm not too sure whether I have the power or appreciation of saying what I can do on a personal level. But I think as communities, as countries, I'm sure we will be able to. And as you said, there is various sources of funds available. But having spoken about that, Adarshji, I'll come to you now. I think there is a lot of conversation around saying how, taxation and compliance, taxation benefits, international taxation, and all these issues can actually be more encouraging for flow of funds. So I'm saying that you are a veteran on the issues of taxation and compliance. In your view, are there tax and compliance issues which might be constraining investments just now in the area of climate change, mitigation and management? And also as a corollary to that, how can investment and taxation policy encourage and incentivize flow of investments into climate action? And that keeps small and marginal farmers' interests in mind.
Thank you, Sudhir. Very interesting one. And I must, like my co-panelists, start with a confession. I do not know when I was invited, it was a session on social impact per se, something that is basically in the realm of great intellectualism. And coming down to a subject of taxation, actually in this aspect of it, perhaps is only for the reason that you can't wish away taxation in this regime. As simple as that. So I perhaps have been invited, so to say, that I have to make these inputs. Before I start on the concept of taxation, which of course, as Sudhir mentioned, is my practice area, I just want to sort of add on to what Vedji just said about the stock exchange. Effectively, Cognisphere is not a candidate for a social stock exchange platform. You have to basically list yourselves on a normal stock exchange with an identifier as being a social enterprise. So you are called a for-profit social enterprise, which is not a candidate for social stock exchange. Somebody who's a candidate for the social stock exchange per se is your parent or your alma mater, the Pradhan group. Actually, they are the best fit persons to actually sort of now get to the social stock exchange and work there. As we speak, I think there are 11 entities who are already there on the two stock exchanges, BSE and NSE. And of course, it brings great amount of credibility. Sasha was talking about the aspects of financing, and I will just take on that before I address Sudhir's question. I know I'm digressing a bit, but I thought I will probably sort of address the topical structure because taxation has just been fixed into the connotation or the title head of the session. In the case of today, what has happened is FCRA, as quite clearly known, has become a somewhat obfuscated methodology because it is now in the glare of the government. As I'm just putting this in a connotation manner, not in any way doing that. But I'll tell you the fact of the matter is that the government has done a commendable structure in bringing in social stock exchange, because that brings in a lot of transparency that would come in to the zero coupon bonds. Actually, in an FCRA platform, FPIs can come in and invest there. FCRA money can come in there. It has all the governance, disclosure, normal management platforms that are there. And it brings in a lot of credibility because it is now actually being regulated by one of the best regulators in India, which is SEBI. So effectively, FCRA can be moved in that which way. Two, also from a standpoint of the social impact platforms, what FCRA did a few years ago was, in fact, it brought in a provision where actually they took out from the definition of foreign source an entity of an international structure coming up in India as a subsidiary and investing out of that subsidiary into the funds. So that was a big improvement in the FCRA platform and regime. And it also brought it closer to the community. People sitting abroad and actually taking advantage of the FCRA regime was somewhat shifted to the fact that the foreign source was actually obliterated vis-a-vis their subsidiaries in India. And that actually has brought in a paradigm shift in basically social impact funds coming in out of the foreign capital, coming in through the subsidiary platform. And also, effectively does an intangible thing. It also sort of actually brings in those entities or the international platforms closer to the community in India, closer to the projects in India. That's a big step forward. Therefore, we are becoming a global village where people are realizing that communities in India are somewhat very important and significant. And that is where the roles of the entities like Cognisphere or Pradhan becoming extremely important. Coming to the taxation aspect of it, you can't live without the government being a stakeholder. You just can't. It is not in India, it is everywhere in the world. You can talk of 5013Cs, we work with a lot of those entities internationally, or whether you look at basically the so-called $3 trillion charity economy in the US, or the potential $11 trillion charity economy by 2050, as is being projected in India. At the end of the day, you can't wish that away without taxation and the taxation norms and the rules. One of the biggest advantages is that India has actually leapfrogged into a structure on the carbon credit platform by announcing a very dignified and a very small rate of taxation. It's a section called 115BBG in income tax, which actually spells out that all of carbon credits or the verified emission rights will only be taxed at 10%, which is a special rate category that's been given to them only to incentivize. So, in one of the earlier sections, the moderator was asking about the incentive structures. That's what the government has done very proactively and positively, where carbon credits today are taxed at a very low rate. And that's effectively to align ourselves with basically the Paris Accord, the SDG. Indian accounting standards on social impacts have changed. They have actually come up, my institute, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, has actually brought in social auditing standards. It is through a social auditing framework. It has 16 thematic areas. All 16 thematic areas actually sync with the SDG sustainable goal platforms and are basically synced into be achieving in by 2030. That is there. Effectively, categorically speaking, or more specifically speaking from the perspective of agriculture, quite clearly the indirect taxation has already provided in a lot of incentives. It is about the fact that there are notifications today in the indirect tax regime in GST, which actually exempt a lot of agri-extension activities, which include forestry and other things that the likes of Cognisphere, or for that matter, the climate partners or others are basically now endeavoring into or venturing into. Now, there is no taxation there. Effectively, whether that no taxation or a full exemption is the right way going forward, one would know only because you lose the input tax credits. At the end of the day, you are basically sort of moving out from the mainstreams of a normal, very excellent platform in the GST structures. That is something that one will have to sort of calculate over a period of time. It is not for it now to be basically sort of saying so at the end of the day. Effectively, carbon credits, or for that matter, a lot of the social impacts coming in from climate change will ultimately have to sink in with the mainstream. Effectively, we have done whatever we have done to the planet thus far. We are now trying to basically improve it. At the end of the day, government is a stakeholder. There will be taxation, directly or indirectly. I would not use the word covert or overt here at the end of the day, because that might become controversial. But at the end of the day, I personally believe today's taxation regime in India is perhaps one of the most progressive in terms of these newer paradigms in both climate change, sustainability at the end of the day, and also is in sync with and fast-pacing itself to align with all thematic areas of the sustainability development goals. This, Sudhir, is, I think, my opening remark on this structure.
Thanks for sharing that. I think one of the things that I wanted to check with you, you mentioned the aspect of social audits. And I understand that you have been part of this process for a few years. How does is there a special benefits or something that accrues if you score well on the social audits? How does it impact, as they said, some of the protectors, some of the people who are doing better practices? If you score better on a social audit, is there a formalized structure where there are some benefits accruing to people?
Yeah, Sudhir, excellent question and a topical question, effectively. As we see most private equity investments, regardless of the fact that social audit, or for that matter, social impact assessments, or for that matter, even what is called the business responsibility, sustainability reporting paradigms, which is mandatory only for the top 1,000 companies as of now, the private equity guys are insisting for even the startup investments that there are to basically comply with what are called the BRSR standards, or for that matter, what are called, these are nothing but adaptations of the GRI platforms or the IRIS accounting structures that there are over a period of time. Now, so BRSR is basically the business responsibility sustainability reporting standard that is there. It is basically not a coinage. It is a legal framework in India under the SEBI Act to basically make disclosures. It is mandatory for the year 22-23. It was actually voluntary for 21-22. It is mandatory for the year 22-23. So over the next weeks, when you see the public listed companies coming up with their balance sheets, they'll all contain the BRSR report. Now, BRSR report is actually having the 16 thematic areas. Effectively, there are 17 in all in the SDG goals of the United Nations. But the Indian thematic areas are 16 in the structure. And of course, the 17th one, Niti Aayog, that is put in is basically, anything else that they can put forth. So it's a residual category. So in the 16 structures, there's an excellent reporting format. It is all on the MCA website. It is there, and all of these guys will have to report. Now, this aspect of basically reporting on qualitative features is actually coming into fore now. This is the key important aspects. This is where, when you read the balance sheets and analyze it, you'll really understand as to what the corporates are doing, what the corporate world is actually working on the qualitative features that there are. Now, there are three. Everybody knows the social impact platforms work on three large principles. One is the qualitative principle. The second one is the quantitative principles. Quantitative is that most people now tend to basically work on things like the social impact card or the social impact score, or funds like I just saw a gentleman from in the earlier session from IntelliCap. They work on their own score platforms that are there. Then there are integrated platforms where people actually sort of work on these integrated structures within the in-house platform that there are. So you have the famous Acumen Bacco ratio that comes in actually on the website that you see. This is called the best available charity option ratios and stuff like that. So all these things have now started to get quantified. They are not only getting quantified, they are also moving from quantification to what is called the monetization principles. So a lot of people are working on that aspect of it. So the private equity funding today is looking at basically everybody working on social impacts, everybody utilizing the structures of even the paradigms, or trying to merge in what is called the CSR funding and the impacts through the CSR structures, putting it in their balance sheets and actually working on it, because of the simple reason that most of these things will become mandatory by the time those private equity guys take an exit out of that venture.
Disclosure is first is to how you become eligible by aligning with the activities that are mentioned in the CSR law. Second is disclosure. Third is social audit. Dr. Sanjeev Gupta, Gurgaon. Social audit is a must for people who sort of enroll on social stock exchange. The idea there is that if the companies are doing it, then why NGOs are not doing it? So there should be an equal playing field.
Sir, to add to what you're saying, effectively, the social audit aspect for NGOs who are now actually getting registered on the social stock exchange has become mandatory.
Yes.
So people like us have all qualified as social auditors now of late, because of the simple reason that it is becoming a mandatory proposition. And I think a lot of big social NGOs or otherwise, as Mr. Arya just put it, will actually voluntarily proceed to get the social audits done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad you are here.
Thank you. Thanks. That was very useful. I just want to go back to Dhruvi for a quick one. And this is not necessarily as being part of the Axis Bank Foundation, but since you are part of the corporate world, financial world, I just want to get a sense from you whether people are looking at issues of climate and climate management from a mandatory and need to do basis, or do you get a sense now that people are now getting alive to the immediacy of action and therefore taking it more in that sense, if I may say, voluntary and on their own initiative?
Right. So, within the larger ESG mandates, and I can specifically talk about us, is there are conscious decisions to look at ESG-based credit evaluations, and gearing up to include a lot of climate change criterias in the way lending happens, especially in certain sectors. And regulatory wise also, I think it's mandatory now. It's also, investors are also not a hard push, but definitely a requirement that is happening. And it's a cursor to how things are going to shape up in the future. And a lot of mitigation is going to happen with certain hard-coded restrictions or conditions in certain credit for certain industries. And it is part of the larger agenda of mitigating the global targets of temperature change. So definitely BSFI sector is gearing up to integrate this formally into the way credit happens.
Okay, thanks for that. I know we can go into further discussion on this, but we are running terribly behind time. So do you want us to open for any questions at this stage, or we need to close this? I see a big shake of the head. So I think because we have another session coming up, and I don't know whether that will happen before lunch, but that's the plan. So my sense from the discussion today, and I'm sure a lot of you might be going back, encourage the fact that there seems to be a lot of funding options and sources to be tapped. I think if we can put together our monitoring and tracking processes and some of the data management processes better, then we are sure that some of both the sourcing of funding and reporting back to where that funding has gone will become far more robust, and we should be able to move towards our objectives far better. So thank you very much. Thank you, Dhruvi. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Ved, and thank you, Adarshji. It was really kind of you. We might want to chat with you a little more further on some of these aspects, especially on the stock exchange aspect.
Anytime.
Thank you so much.